Have you ever been told to just get over something that completely destroyed your world? Have you ever had the people who were supposed to protect you turn into the very ones who hurt you most? Well, let me tell you what happened to me, and I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll understand why some betrayals are simply unforgivable, and why sometimes the only way to heal is to fight back with everything you've got. My name doesn't matter, but my story does, because it's about standing up when everyone expects you to stay down, about finding strength in the darkest moments, and about making people face consequences they never thought would come. This isn't just about money, though. That's what they'll tell you it was about. This is about dignity, about justice, about refusing to let toxic people gaslight you into believing that your pain doesn't matter. So buckle up, because what I'm about to share with you changed my entire life, and it might just change the way you think about family loyalty forever. It started 3 years ago when my father passed away. I know what you're thinking. Grief makes people do strange things, and you'd be right. But what my family did went far beyond strange. My father was my rock, my mentor, the one person in this world who truly understood me. We had this connection that went deeper than blood, you know? He was the kind of dad who remembered every little detail about my life, who called me every Sunday morning just to hear my voice, who believed in my dreams even when I didn't believe in them myself. Growing up, while my siblings were off doing their own thing, I was the one who spent hours in his workshop, learning about life, about integrity, about what it means to be a good person. I was the one who sat with him during his chemotherapy treatments, holding his hand when the nausea got too bad, reading to him when he was too weak to hold a book himself. I was there for every doctor's appointment, every bad news delivery, every moment of fear and hope. My siblings? They had excuses. Always excuses. Work was too demanding, kids needed attention, life was just too busy. But I made time because that's what love does. It makes time. When he died, I felt like someone had ripped out half of my soul. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and fake sympathy. People who hadn't visited him once during his illness suddenly appearing with tears and flowers, talking about what a great man he was as if they had any right to claim they knew him. I stood there numb, feeling like I was watching my life from outside my body. My mother stood beside me, and I remember thinking how small she looked, how fragile. My older brother Marcus and my sister Diane were there with their families, playing their parts perfectly, the grieving children who loved their father so much. But I knew the truth. I knew that Marcus had visited exactly twice during Dad's 8-month battle with cancer, and Diane had come maybe 4 times, always rushing out after an hour with some excuse about her kids' activities. But there I was, the youngest, the one who had put my life on hold for almost a year to be there for him, standing in that cemetery feeling like my heart had been buried along with his casket. The real nightmare began about 2 weeks after the funeral. We all gathered at Mom's house for the reading of the will. Dad had been a successful man, not wealthy by billionaire standards, but comfortable. He'd built a small but profitable business, invested wisely, and had always been careful with money. I wasn't expecting much, honestly. I had never done anything for him expecting payment or inheritance. My love wasn't transactional, but I knew he had wanted to take care of all of us, to make sure we'd be okay after he was gone. The lawyer, Mr. Peterson, a kind elderly man who had known our family for decades, sat at the head of the dining room table with this official-looking document in front of him. I remember the smell of Mom's coffee, the way the afternoon light came through the curtains, the sound of my sister's fingernails tapping on the table. Everything felt surreal, like I was in a movie about someone else's life. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat and began reading. The house would go to Mom, of course. That made sense. Some investments would be split between the 3 of us kids. Okay, fair enough. And then came the part that made my heart stop. Dad had left a specific trust fund for me, separate from everything else. It was substantial, around $350,000, with a letter attached explaining why. Mr. Peterson's voice cracked a little as he read Dad's words that said I had been his light during the darkest time of his life, that my devotion and love had given him peace in his final months, that this money was not just inheritance but gratitude, a way to help me build the life I had put on hold to care for him. He wrote that he knew I would use it wisely, that he trusted me completely, and that he loved me more than words could express. I sat there with tears streaming down my face, not because of the money, but because those words were like getting one last hug from him, one last moment of connection. But as I looked up through my tears, I saw the faces of my family, and something cold slithered down my spine. My mother's expression was blank, unreadable. Marcus looked angry, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes hard. Diane wouldn't even look at me. staring down at the table with her lips pressed into a thin line. The atmosphere in that room shifted so dramatically it was like someone had opened a window in the middle of winter. Mr. Peterson continued reading, wrapping up the various other bequests and instructions, but I barely heard any of it. All I could feel was the tension, the resentment radiating from my siblings like heat from asphalt on a summer day. When Mr. Peterson finished and asked if anyone had questions, Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made me flinch. He muttered something about needing air and walked out. Diane followed him without a word. And my mother. She just looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read and said we'd talk later. I left that house feeling confused and hurt, clutching the copy of the will Mr. Peterson had given me, wondering why something that should have been a beautiful final gift from my father felt like it had just painted a target on my back. The next few weeks were strange. My family barely contacted me. When I called my mother, she was distant, giving short answers and always having a reason to get off the phone quickly. Marcus didn't return my calls at all. Diane sent brief text messages that were polite but cold. I thought maybe they needed time to process their grief, that maybe seeing Dad acknowledge my care so publicly had made them feel guilty about their absence. I tried to be understanding, to give them space, even though their distance hurt me deeply. I was grieving too, probably more than any of them, and I needed my family. But they had disappeared right when I needed them most. I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the pain, going through each day like a zombie, crying myself to sleep most nights, talking to Dad's picture like he could still hear me. The money sat untouched in the trust account. I couldn't even think about it without feeling overwhelmed. About 6 weeks after Dad's death, I got a call from Mr. Peterson. His voice sounded concerned, careful, like he was trying to figure out how to tell me something difficult. He asked if I could come to his office, that there was a matter we needed to discuss regarding the estate. My stomach dropped. Something in his tone told me this wasn't good news. I drove to his office the next morning, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my mind racing through every possible scenario. When I walked into his office, he gestured for me to sit down and then slid a document across his desk toward me. It was a petition filed by my mother, Marcus, and Diane. They were contesting the will. I stared at those words, reading them over and over, trying to make them make sense in my brain. Contesting the will. They were legally challenging Dad's final wishes. My hands started trembling so badly I could barely hold the paper. Mr. Peterson explained that they were claiming my father had been under undue influence when he created the trust for me, that I had manipulated him during his illness when he was vulnerable and not thinking clearly, that the distribution of assets was unfair, and that the money should be split equally among all the children. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. Undue influence? Manipulation? I had loved my father with every fiber of my being. I had cared for him not expecting anything in return, certainly not with some calculated plan to secure an inheritance. The accusation was so vile, so completely opposite of the truth, that I couldn't even process it at first. I just sat there in that leather chair in Mr. Peterson's office, staring at the document, feeling like the entire world had tilted sideways. Mr. Peterson was talking, explaining legal procedures and timelines, but I couldn't hear him over the roaring in my ears. My own family was calling me a manipulator, a con artist who had taken advantage of a dying man. My own mother, who I had supported through the worst time of her life, was signing her name to these accusations. I drove home in a daze, nearly running a red light, not even remembering the route I took. When I got to my apartment, I collapsed on the couch and cried harder than I had even cried at Dad's funeral. These weren't tears of grief anymore. These were tears of betrayal, of rage, of complete disbelief. How could they do this? How could they twist something so pure, my love for my father, into something dirty and calculated? I called my mother. I needed to hear her explain this, needed to understand what could possibly justify this action. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice cool and distant. When I asked her why she would do this to me, she sighed like I was being dramatic and said that the money should be split fairly, that it wasn't right for me to get so much more just because I happened to have more free time to spend with Dad. Happened to have more free time? I had sacrificed my career advancement, my social life, my own health to be there for him, but she made it sound like I had just casually stopped by when I had nothing better to do. I tried to reason with her, my voice shaking, asking her to remember all those nights I slept on the hospital room couch, all those times I called her with updates because she couldn't be bothered to come herself, all those moments I held Dad's hand through the pain. She cut me off and said that everyone grieves differently, that Marcus and Diane had their own ways of loving Dad, and that I was being selfish by thinking my way was superior. Selfish. She called me selfish for being hurt that they were trying to take away Dad's final gift to me. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She said I needed to just get over it, that Dad was gone and fighting about money wasn't going to bring him back, that I was tearing the family apart by being stubborn. Get over it. Like my father's death was a bad grade on a test or a failed relationship. Like the complete betrayal by my entire family was something I should just shrug off and move past. I hung up on her, something I had never done in my entire life, and I sat in the dark of my apartment feeling more alone than I ever thought possible. The next few days were a special kind of torture. I would wake up and for just a moment I'd forget, and then reality would crash back down on me. I stopped eating properly, lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, stopped answering calls from friends who wanted to check on me. I felt paralyzed, stuck between the urge to fight back and the voice in my head telling me that fighting my family made me the villain they were claiming I was. Marcus sent me a text message, the first communication I'd had from him since the will reading. It said that if I agreed to split the trust fund equally, they would drop the legal challenge and we could all move on as a family. Move on as a family. As if family meant so little that it could be bought and sold and bartered like a commodity. The message made it clear that this wasn't about fairness or Dad's mental state. This was about them wanting the money and being willing to destroy me to get it. They had calculated, probably within hours of that will reading, that they could use the legal system to bully me into giving up what Dad had wanted me to have. They had sat around, maybe at Marcus's house over dinner, and planned this whole strategy, discussing how to phrase the accusations, how to make me look bad, how to force my hand. I spent a week in this fog of indecision and pain. Part of me wanted to just give them the money and be done with it, to buy back some semblance of family relationship, even if it would be forever tainted. But every time I almost convinced myself to do it, I would remember Dad's letter, his words about trust and love, about wanting to take care of me. Giving up that money wouldn't just be losing money. It would be betraying Dad's final wish, validating my family's lies about me, and teaching them that bullying and manipulation works. I realized that my father had given me that money, not just as a gift, but as a test. Not a test of me, but a test of them. And they had failed spectacularly. He had probably known, on some level, that this might happen. He had seen how they behaved during his illness, heard their excuses, noticed their absence, and he had still hoped they would be better, but he had protected me just in case they weren't. That realization hit me like lightning. Dad had seen this coming. He had known his other children well enough to predict their reaction, and he had tried to safeguard his gift to me anyway. That meant I had a responsibility not to let his precautions be in vain. I made a decision. I was going to fight back. Not because I was greedy or materialistic, but because this was about principle, about honoring my father, about refusing to be gaslit and manipulated by people who were supposed to love me. I called Mr. Peterson back and told him I would contest their challenge, that I wanted to fight this with everything I had. He was quiet for a moment, then said he was glad to hear it, that he had known my father well and knew that the accusations were baseless. But he also warned me that this would get ugly, that family legal battles always do, and that I needed to be prepared for them to say and do things that would hurt me deeply. I told him I was already hurt as deeply as possible, that they had already done their worst by betraying me. I was wrong about that, though. I had no idea how much worse it was going to get. Mr. Peterson recommended a lawyer who specialized in estate litigation, a woman named Sarah Chen, who had a reputation for being brilliant and absolutely ruthless when she needed to be. I met with Sarah 2 days later in her downtown office, and I knew within 5 minutes that she was exactly who I needed on my side. Sarah was in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through any bullshit. I told her everything, the whole story from beginning to end, and she listened without interrupting, taking notes, occasionally nodding. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said 3 words that changed everything. "We'll destroy them." She explained that their case was weak, that claiming undue influence required them to prove I had somehow isolated Dad from his family or manipulated his decision-making, and that the evidence would actually show the opposite. Dad had been of completely sound mind, had used a reputable lawyer, had made his wishes clear in writing, and the trust had been created months before his death, not in some last-minute deathbed change. Furthermore, the fact that they had largely abandoned him during his illness while I cared for him would actually support Dad's reasoning, not undermine it. Sarah said that if we played this right, not only would we defeat their challenge, but we could potentially go after them for legal fees and maybe even pursue a counterclaim for emotional distress. The way she said it calm and confident, made me feel something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. But Sarah also warned me about what was coming. She said that estate litigation brings out the absolute worst in people, that my family would likely dig up anything they could from my past to make me look bad, that they would twist innocent moments into sinister plots, that they would probably try to turn other family members and friends against me. She asked if I was ready for that, if I had the emotional strength to see this through even when it felt like my entire world was burning down around me. I thought about Dad, about how he had fought through the pain and fear of cancer with such grace and courage. I thought about all the times he had told me that standing up for what's right is rarely easy, but always necessary. And I looked Sarah Chen in the eye and said yes, I was ready. I signed the retainer agreement right there, and just like that, I had declared war on my own family. Have you ever had to make a choice between what's easy and what's right, knowing that the right choice would cost you everything? Comment below if you've ever been in that impossible position. The legal proceedings began, and it was every bit as awful as Sarah had predicted. Discovery started, which meant both sides could request documents and information from each other. My family's lawyers sent over interrogatories, formal written questions I had to answer under oath. The questions were designed to paint me as calculating and manipulative. They asked about every conversation I'd had with Dad about finances, every time I had driven him to appointments, every gift he had ever given me. They were trying to build a narrative that I had been systematically positioning myself for this inheritance for years. I had to sit at my kitchen table, reliving every beautiful memory of caring for my father, and describe them in sterile legal language to be picked apart by lawyers looking for sinister motives. It was like having someone dissect your heart while it was still beating, but we had our own ammunition. Sarah subpoenaed records from the hospital showing which family members had visited Dad and how often. The data was damning. Over 8 months of treatment, I had been present for 93% of his appointments and treatments. Marcus had attended exactly 6 times. Diane had been there 12 times. My mother had come more regularly, maybe 40% of the time, but even that was revealing. We gathered testimony from nurses who remembered me sleeping in the hospital room, from Dad's friends who had witnessed my devotion, from neighbors who had seen me coming and going from my parents' house at all hours to help with care. We collected every card, every note, every email Dad had sent me expressing his gratitude and love. The evidence wasn't just overwhelming. It was a love story written in medical records and witness statements, a documentary of genuine devotion that couldn't be faked or manufactured. Sarah compiled it all into a brief that read like an indictment not just of their legal case, but of their character. Meanwhile, the family warfare escalated outside the courtroom. Marcus started calling other relatives, spreading his version of the story. He told everyone that I had isolated Dad from the family, that I had poisoned his mind against them, that I was a master manipulator who had played on a sick man's emotions for financial gain. He was so convincing that some of my aunts and uncles started to believe him. I would get phone calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, calling to tell me I should be ashamed of myself, that Dad would be disappointed in me for tearing the family apart. The irony was excruciating. I was tearing the family apart? I wasn't the one who had filed a legal challenge. I wasn't the one making up lies. But somehow, in their narrative, defending myself against their baseless accusations made me the aggressor. Diane took to social media, posting vague status updates about betrayal and greed and people who use others for money. She never mentioned me by name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. I watched my comment sections fill up with relatives taking sides, some defending me, but many more attacking me. All of this public family drama playing out for everyone to see. My mother called me periodically, always with the same message. Just settle. Just give them half. Just make this go away so we can be a family again. Each time, her voice would have this quality to it, like she was talking to a stubborn child who refused to see reason. She would remind me that money wasn't worth destroying family relationships over, that Dad would want us to get along, that I was being prideful and selfish. The gaslighting was so subtle and so consistent that I sometimes found myself doubting my own reality. Was I being selfish? Was I putting money over family? But then I would read Dad's letter again, would remember the things they were saying about me in legal documents, would recall that I wasn't the one who had started this fight, and my resolve would harden. Sarah coached me through these moments, reminding me that manipulation often looks like concern, that toxic people are experts at making you feel crazy for having boundaries. She told me that what I was experiencing had a name: Darvo, deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. They were denying their own greed, attacking my character, and making themselves the victims of my supposedly unreasonable refusal to be robbed. The depositions were brutal. I had to sit in a conference room with my family's lawyer, a smug man named Richard Donnelly, who reminded me of every entitled bully I'd ever met, and answer his questions while Sarah sat beside me. Donnelly asked me about my finances, suggesting that I had been struggling with money and therefore had motive to manipulate my father. He asked about my personal life, implying that my lack of a serious relationship meant I was lonely and had latched onto Dad inappropriately. He asked about conversations I'd had with Dad, taking innocent statements and twisting them into evidence of manipulation. At one point, he suggested that I had deliberately kept my siblings away from Dad so I could have more influence over him. I snapped. I asked him if he was seriously suggesting that I had somehow forced two adult professionals to neglect their dying father, if he thought I had the power to make them choose their convenience over their dad's comfort. Sarah touched my arm, a signal to stay calm, but I could see in her eyes that she was proud of me for pushing back. When it was my family's turn to be deposed, I got to see Sarah Chen in action, and it was beautiful in a terrifying way. She questioned my mother first, asking her detailed questions about Dad's mental state, his decision-making ability, his relationships with each of his children. My mother tried to paint a picture of Dad as confused and easily influenced in his final months, but Sarah had medical records showing his cognitive function was perfect until the very end. She had testimony from his doctors that he was lucid, informed, and capable of making complex decisions. She had notes from Mr. Peterson about his meetings with Dad to draft the will, describing him as clear-headed and specific about his intentions. My mother's testimony fell apart under the weight of the evidence. Sarah then asked her a question that made everyone in the room go silent. "Mrs. Patterson, how many of your husband's chemotherapy sessions did you attend?" My mother hesitated, then admitted it was about 30 or 40%. "And how many did your daughter attend?" Sarah already knew the answer, of course. "Most of them," my mother whispered. 93% according to hospital records, Sarah corrected. "So your husband, in his will, chose to give additional funds to the child who was present for 93% of his cancer treatments, while his other children were present for less than 10% combined. And you believe this decision was the result of manipulation rather than gratitude?" Marcus's deposition was even worse for them. He tried to maintain his angry, self-righteous stance, but Sarah dismantled him piece by piece. She asked him about specific dates when Dad had been in the hospital, and where Marcus had been instead. Business trips, golf outings, kids' soccer games, normal life activities that he had prioritized over his father's health crisis. She asked if he had offered to help with any of Dad's medical expenses or care costs. He hadn't. She asked if he had offered to help me with the burden of caregiving, maybe setting up a rotation or hiring additional help. He hadn't. She asked if he had visited Dad in the hospital the week before he died. He hadn't. Then she asked the killer question. "Mr. Patterson, if your father's will had left everything equally divided among his 3 children, would you have had any concerns about his mental competence or susceptibility to undue influence?" Marcus's lawyer objected, but the question hung in the air. Everyone in that room knew the answer. He wouldn't have challenged a damn thing if he'd gotten what he wanted. This wasn't about protecting Dad's wishes or ensuring his will reflected his true intentions. This was about greed, pure and simple. Diane's deposition revealed something I hadn't expected. She actually broke down crying at one point, admitting that she felt guilty about not being there more for Dad, that she had convinced herself that her kids needed her more, that she had believed she would have more time. For a moment, sitting there watching my sister sob into her hands, I felt a flicker of sympathy. Grief and guilt are powerful emotions, and I understood that she was probably dealing with a lot of regret. But then Sarah asked her a simple question. "Ms. Patterson, did you discuss these feelings of guilt with your sister at any point before deciding to contest the will?" Diane wiped her eyes and said no. "Did you consider that your sister might also be grieving, that she might need family support rather than legal accusations?" Diane didn't answer. "Did it occur to you that contesting your father's will might hurt your sister, who had sacrificed so much to care for him?" Still no answer. Sarah let the silence stretch out, making the point without words. Diane's guilt and grief might be real, but she had chosen to channel those feelings into attacking me rather than dealing with them honestly. That made her complicit in this betrayal, regardless of her tears. As the legal battle dragged on for months, I felt like I was living in a surreal nightmare. I would go to work and try to focus on my job, but my mind would constantly drift back to the case. I would lie awake at night replaying conversations, wondering what I could have done differently, imagining the moment when all of this would finally be over. The stress was eating me alive. I lost 15 pounds. I developed insomnia. I started having panic attacks, my heart racing and my breath coming in short gasps, feeling like the walls were closing in. I saw a therapist who helped me understand that what I was experiencing was a form of complex trauma. That betrayal by family members triggers something primal in us, a violation of our most basic trust. She taught me coping mechanisms, breathing exercises, ways to ground myself when the anxiety got too bad. She also validated my decision to fight, telling me that sometimes the healthiest thing we can do is refuse to accept abuse, even when that refusal comes at a high cost. Sarah kept me updated on every development, every motion filed, every response submitted. My family's lawyers were trying every tactic they could think of. They filed motions to delay the proceedings, hoping I would run out of money for legal fees and be forced to settle. They tried to get Dad's medical records sealed, claiming privacy concerns, because those records proved his competence. They attempted to bring in a handwriting expert to suggest Dad's signature on the trust documents might be forged, a claim so desperate and baseless that even their own expert refused to testify to it. Each new tactic was more outrageous than the last, and each one failed. Sarah was systematically destroying their case, filing briefs so thorough and well-argued that even the judge commented on the quality of our legal work. I could see the end coming, could see that we were going to win, but the knowledge didn't bring me the satisfaction I had expected. Even in victory, I was losing my family. Even in being proven right, I was becoming an orphan all over again. About 10 months into the legal battle, Sarah called me with news. My family's lawyers had reached out about settlement discussions. They wanted to negotiate. I felt a mix of triumph and exhaustion. "What are they offering?" I asked. Sarah's voice was dry. "They've offered to drop the contest if you agree to split the trust 70-30 in your favor instead of keeping it all." I laughed, a bitter sound. "So they want me to pay them $100,000 to stop lying about me?" Sarah said that was essentially correct. Yes. I asked her what she recommended. She said that from a purely practical standpoint, settling would end the stress and save on legal fees going forward, and that I would still walk away with more than twice what they'd get. But she also said that if I wanted to see this through to a verdict, we would almost certainly win, and we could pursue them for the costs they'd put me through. I thought about it for a long time. Thought about Dad, about what he would want. And I realized that he wouldn't want me to settle. He had left me that money specifically because he knew I had earned it through love and sacrifice, and giving any of it to people who had betrayed both of us would be spitting on his grave. I told Sarah no settlement. We were going to trial. The trial was set for early spring, almost a year after Dad's death. As the date approached, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I had been through the worst of this already. The depositions, the accusations, the family betrayal, the public drama, all of it had happened. The trial itself was just the final act, the official record of what I had already lived through. Sarah prepared me thoroughly, doing practice sessions where she played both our side and theirs, teaching me how to stay composed on the witness stand, how to answer questions directly without getting defensive or emotional. She reminded me that the truth was on our side, that the evidence was overwhelming, and that all I had to do was tell my story honestly. The night before trial, I couldn't sleep. I sat up looking at old photos of Dad and me, reading through cards he had sent me over the years, preparing myself to stand up in court and fight for his memory one last time. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, less dramatic than what you see on TV. Just a wood-paneled room with uncomfortable benches, fluorescent lights, and an American flag in the corner. My family sat on one side with their lawyer. I sat on the other side with Sarah. We didn't look at each other. I could feel the tension, though, the weight of everything unsaid and everything that had been said too harshly. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judge Hartley, called the court to order and asked for opening statements. My family's lawyer went first, painting a picture of a vulnerable elderly man, sick and dying, being manipulated by a daughter who isolated him and played on his emotions. He made me sound like a calculating predator, someone who had seen an opportunity in her father's illness and seized it. Listening to him talk about me, about Dad, about our relationship, I felt physically ill. But I kept my face neutral, just like Sarah had taught me, because I knew that showing emotion would be used against me. Then it was Sarah's turn, and she stood up with a confidence that filled the room. She told the judge that this case wasn't complicated, that it was simply about a father who wanted to thank the daughter who had loved him selflessly during the hardest time of his life. She laid out the facts, the hospital records, the testimony from medical professionals, the timeline of the will's creation, the clear and consistent statements from Dad about his wishes. She explained that what we would prove was not that I had influenced Dad, but that his other children had ignored him, and that his decision to leave me additional funds was the natural result of gratitude, not manipulation. She quoted from Dad's letter, her voice strong and clear, and I saw the judge lean forward, paying close attention. By the time Sarah sat down, the tone in that courtroom had shifted. We had gone from defending against accusations to presenting the truth of what had actually happened. And the truth was far more powerful than their lies. The trial lasted 3 days. 3 days of testimony, of evidence presentation, of legal arguments. I took the stand and told my story, answering Sarah's questions with as much honesty and detail as I could manage. I talked about Dad's diagnosis, about rearranging my life to care for him, about the hundreds of hours spent in hospitals and treatment centers. I talked about the conversations we had, the moments of connection, the way he had thanked me over and over for being there. I described watching him get weaker, seeing the fear in his eyes, holding his hand while he cried from pain. And I explained that never, not even once, had we discussed inheritance or money in the context of his gratitude. He had thanked me for my love, not for financial services rendered. Under cross-examination, their lawyer tried to trip me up, asking the same questions Donnelly had asked in deposition, trying to make my care seem calculated. But I had the truth on my side, and the truth doesn't change no matter how many times you're asked about it. I looked that lawyer in the eye and told him that I would have done everything exactly the same, even if Dad had died broke and left me nothing, because that's what love is. You don't calculate the return on investment of caring for your dying parent. You just do it because they're your parent and you love them. The nurses testified, describing how I had essentially lived at the hospital, how I had learned to manage Dad's medications, how I had been there for every setback and small victory. Dad's friends testified about conversations they'd had with him where he spoke about how grateful he was for me, how he worried that I was sacrificing too much, how he wanted to find a way to pay me back for everything I'd done. Mr. Peterson testified about the meetings he'd had with Dad to draft the will, describing him as completely lucid, making jokes, asking detailed questions, being very specific about wanting to create the trust for me. He testified that Dad had anticipated there might be family conflict about it, and that he had been very clear that this was his choice, not mine, and that he was at peace with it. The medical records were entered into evidence, page after page of documentation showing Dad's cognitive function tests, all normal. The timeline was entered, showing that the trust had been created 6 months before his death, when he was still relatively healthy, completely demolishing their claim that this was a last-minute decision made by a dying, confused man. My family's side of the case was weak, and watching them present, it was almost sad. They couldn't provide any evidence of manipulation because there wasn't any. They tried to call character witnesses who would say I was money-focused or calculating, but none of their witnesses had even been around during Dad's illness, so their testimony was irrelevant. Marcus took the stand and tried to explain why he hadn't been more present, talking about work obligations and family responsibilities, but under Sarah's cross-examination, he was forced to admit that he had also found time for leisure activities, that his absence had been a choice. Diane testified about her guilt and regret, but when Sarah asked her to identify any specific instance where I had prevented her from visiting Dad or had manipulated him against his other children, she couldn't provide a single example. My mother took the stand and tried to maintain that Dad hadn't really meant to create such a disparity in the inheritance, that he would have wanted everything split equally, but she couldn't explain how she knew that when he had specifically written otherwise in his will with clear explanations. Their entire case rested on the claim that it was somehow suspicious for a man to leave more money to the child who had cared for him, as if gratitude itself was evidence of undue influence. The closing arguments came on the afternoon of the third day. My family's lawyer made one last attempt to paint me as a villain, but his words rang hollow after 3 days of evidence to the contrary. Sarah's closing argument was masterful. She walked the judge through every piece of evidence, building an irrefutable narrative of a daughter who had loved her father and a father who had wanted to thank her for it. She pointed out that my family had the burden of proof, that they had to show undue influence actually occurred, and that they had failed completely to meet that burden. She reminded the judge that this wasn't about whether the inheritance was fair by someone's abstract standard, but about whether Dad had the right to dispose of his property as he saw fit, and whether he had done so freely and competently. The answer to both questions was obviously yes. She finished by saying that what we were really asking the court to do was protect a dead man's final wishes from family members who had failed him in life and were now trying to profit from his death. The courtroom was silent when she sat down. I could barely breathe, waiting for what came next. Judge Hartley said she would take the matter under advisement and issue a written ruling within 2 weeks. 2 more weeks of waiting, of not knowing, of existing in this limbo between vindication and defeat. Those 2 weeks felt longer than the entire previous year. I tried to go back to some semblance of normal life, but I was too anxious, too wired, too aware that everything hung in the balance. Sarah called me several times to check in, always reassuring me that she felt good about our case, that the judge had seemed receptive to our arguments. But we both knew that until there was an official ruling, anything could happen. I distracted myself by starting to think about the future, about what I would do if we won, about how I might use at least some of that money in ways that would honor Dad's memory. I thought about maybe setting up a scholarship for nursing students or making a donation to the cancer center where he had been treated. I wanted to do something that would turn this ugly fight into something positive, something that Dad would have been proud of. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was at work, sitting through a meeting I couldn't focus on, when my phone buzzed with Sarah's number. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. "We won," Sarah said simply. "Complete victory. The judge ruled that your father was completely competent, that there was no evidence of undue influence, that his will was valid and should be executed as written. She also awarded us attorney's fees, meaning your family has to pay for your legal costs. It's over. You won." I stood in that hallway and cried, deep shaking sobs of relief and grief and triumph all mixed together. Coworkers walked past giving me concerned looks, but I didn't care. After a year of hell, after being called a manipulator and a thief by my own family, after defending my love for my father against people who should have understood it better than anyone, I had been vindicated. The legal system had looked at all the evidence and said what I had known all along. I had done nothing wrong, and my family had failed in every possible way. The written ruling came a few days later, and I read it multiple times, savoring every word. Judge Hartley had written a scathing assessment of my family's case, noting that their claims were not supported by any credible evidence and seemed motivated by disappointment about the inheritance distribution rather than genuine concern about their father's competence or welfare. She wrote that the evidence showed clearly that my father had been grateful for my care and had every right to express that gratitude through his estate planning. She wrote that attempts by disappointed heirs to overturn clear and valid wills undermine the fundamental right of individuals to control the disposition of their property. She noted that I had proven to be exactly the devoted daughter my father had described in his letter, and that his trust in me had been completely justified. Reading those words that validated everything I had been through, everything I had fought for, I felt something break open inside me. The wound my family had created was still there, still painful, but now it had a chance to heal because the truth had been officially recognized. The aftermath was complicated. My family had to pay my attorney's fees, which ended up being substantial. Sarah's bill had been over $100,000, and they were legally required to reimburse me for it. The trust fund was transferred to me completely, along with the accrued interest. I suddenly had nearly $400,000, money that my father had wanted me to have, money that I had literally had to go to war to protect. But I also had no family. My mother sent me a brief email saying that I had made my choice and she hoped I was happy with it, as if I had been the one to destroy our relationships rather than simply defending myself against their attacks. Marcus and Diane didn't contact me at all. Other relatives who had taken sides during the battle stayed on their respective sides. Some cousins and aunts who had believed my family's lies never apologized or acknowledged that they had been wrong about me. The family fracture was complete and seemingly permanent. I had won the legal battle but lost my family in the process. In the months after the ruling, I had to figure out how to rebuild my life. I was financially secure for the first time ever, but emotionally devastated. I continued therapy, working through the trauma of the betrayal and the legal battle. My therapist helped me understand that grief comes in many forms, that I was not only grieving the loss of my father, but also grieving the loss of the family I thought I had, the mother and siblings I had believed would support me rather than attack me. She helped me see that their betrayal, while incredibly painful, had also revealed important truths about who they really were, truths that might have taken much longer to discover in other circumstances. She reminded me that protecting my boundaries and standing up for myself, even at great cost, was an act of self-respect and mental health. Slowly, painfully, I began to accept that the family I had grown up with was gone, not because I had destroyed it, but because it had destroyed itself through greed and cruelty. I started making decisions about the money with Dad's values in mind. I set up a scholarship fund at the local university for students pursuing healthcare careers, specifically for those who demonstrated commitment to compassionate patient care. I made a large donation to the cancer center in Dad's name. I invested most of the rest carefully, following the advice of a financial planner, ensuring that Dad's gift would continue to provide security for my future. I kept some aside for travel, thinking about all the trips Dad and I had talked about taking together once he recovered. Trips we never got to take. I decided to take some of those trips for both of us, to see the places he had wanted to see, to live the life he had wanted me to live. I bought a small house, nothing extravagant, but something that was mine, something that represented stability and a fresh start. Each decision I made, I thought about whether Dad would approve, and that connection to him helped me heal. I also started to build a chosen family. I grew closer to friends who had supported me through the ordeal, people who had believed in me when it would have been easier to stay neutral or side with my blood relatives. I connected with other people who had gone through similar experiences of family betrayal, finding comfort in knowing I wasn't alone in this strange and painful situation. I started dating someone who knew my whole story and didn't judge me for it. Someone who understood that family trauma is real and valid. Slowly, my life began to feel less like a battlefield and more like a home. The wound my family had created was still there, still tender, but I was learning to live with it, to see it as part of my story rather than the defining feature of my identity. I was more than what they had done to me. I was also everything Dad had seen in me. Strong, loving, principled, and worthy of respect. Looking back now, 3 years after Dad's death and 2 years after the trial ended, I have complicated feelings about everything that happened. I don't regret fighting for what Dad wanted me to have. I would make the same decision again, even knowing the cost. But I also grieve the family I lost, or more accurately, the family I thought I had but never really did. I've come to understand that my father's gift wasn't just the money. It was the revelation of who my family really was, what they were capable of when tested. That knowledge, as painful as it is, has been valuable. It freed me from the obligation to maintain relationships with people who were willing to destroy me for their own benefit. It taught me that sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is walk away, even when walking away means walking away from family. It showed me that I was stronger than I ever knew, capable of standing alone against people I had always believed I needed. Have you ever had to choose between what's right and what's comfortable? Have you ever had to stand up against your own family? Has anyone ever told you to just get over something that fundamentally changed who you are? I want to hear your stories. Comment below and tell me about a time you had to fight for what was right, even when everyone told you to let it go. These stories matter. Your experiences matter. And I truly believe that sharing them helps all of us feel less alone in our struggles. Understanding this kind of betrayal, this kind of family conflict, it's not something you can really grasp until you've lived through it. It changes you on a fundamental level. You lose a kind of innocence about family relationships, about trust, about the people you thought would always be in your corner. But you also gain something: clarity, self-respect, and the knowledge that you can survive things you never thought you could survive. If this story resonated with you, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you of your own battles or helped you understand someone else's struggle, please leave a like on this video. It really helps spread these stories to people who need to hear them. And if you want more real-life stories like this, stories about people facing impossible choices and finding the strength to do what's right, subscribe to Living Through It and hit that notification bell. We share stories here that don't get told enough. Stories about the messy, complicated, painful, and ultimately triumphant moments that define us as human beings. This channel is about real people going through real things and about the courage it takes to keep going when everything feels impossible. Your support means everything and helps us continue creating this content. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring enough to make it this far. And remember, sometimes getting over it isn't the answer. Sometimes the answer is getting a lawyer and making them get over their own greed and cruelty. Sometimes the answer is fighting back, not because it's easy, but because your dignity and your truth are worth fighting for. I hope you never have to learn that lesson the way I did, but if you do, I hope you have the strength to stand your ground just like my father knew I would.